In the beginning, there was only the slow, ancient language of water and wind, a conversation held across the wide, flat expanses of Iowa Territory, where the Cattail marshes whispered their secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Jessamine Tulliver had listened her entire life, had been trained in the art of listening by a mother who understood that every plant, every animal, every movement of air and water carried meaning beyond the surface. Her mother had taught her to listen back in the bayous outside Thibault, Louisiana, where the air hung thick and green and viscous with the promise and threat of life, where the sound of growing things never ceased, not even in the darkest hours of night when most people slept, and the only sound was the respiration of the marshes themselves. There, among the brackish waterways and the great cathedral of live oak trees with their spreading arms, among the cypress knees emerging from the slow water like ancient sentinels keeping vigil, Jessamine had learned that every plant holds a story written in the language of chemistry and form and seasonal rhythm. Every root and stem and leaf carries information for those willing to decode it with patience and respect. Her mother had taught her that a woman who knows the stories never goes hungry, never goes cold, never truly stands alone in the way that isolation demands and despair creates. Her mother called herself Marguerite, though the Creole traiteurs of the Bayou region knew her by many other names: healer, herbalist, woman who talks to roots, the small-voiced one who could coax medicine from a handful of swamp plants and fragments of bark and roots. She was the keeper of knowledge that predated written language and stretched back into generations beyond counting. Knowledge that had been whispered from mother to daughter for more years than anyone could record. Jessamine was 12 years old when her mother first took her into the shallow water of the Cattail marshes, where the great brown seed heads rose like candles on a massive altar, and taught her to recognize the finest specimens with the precision of a jeweler selecting diamonds from rough stones. "Look here, ma chère," her mother would say, running her dark fingers along the cylindrical seed heads, dense and tight with the promise of thousands of small lives waiting for water and wind to carry them to new ground where they might germinate and grow into tall plants. Each one of these, see how the papery structure catches the light? Each one holds 250,000 seeds, and each seed wraps itself in silk finer than any fabric a town merchant could sell you, finer than anything woven on mechanical looms in the distant north. The water birds use this down to build their nests, to create structures that float on water and hold warmth through winter storms. They know what your ancestors knew, what your ancestors understood from necessity and observation. They know that this fiber keeps you warm when nothing else will, that it holds air like the thinnest, lightest cloud, that it is the most democratic insulation nature offers, available to anyone willing to learn where to find it and how to harvest it respectfully. Jessamine learned to harvest at the precise moment when the brown heads were fully mature, when every seed had reached its maximum weight and the fibers had developed their full silkiness, but before the autumn wind had begun to disperse the seeds into the air where they would drift on the currents like parachutes seeking new ground. She learned to twist the heads free with a motion that was almost a caress, that showed respect for the plant as a living thing worthy of consideration. She would lay them out in the sun to complete their drying in the heat of the day, and then she would work patient hours through the afternoons, breaking apart the dense cylinders with her own hands, never using tools that might damage the delicate fibers. She watched the pale, silky fibers bloom and expand like magic, like something living itself being released from a long captivity. She understood even then that this simple transformation from compressed seed head to fluffy insulation was a process that nature had perfected over millions of years. Her fingers became stained with the tannins from the seed heads, brown stains that would not wash away easily, and the down clung to her hair and her dark indigo dress, a dress woven from cloth dyed with the very same indigo that had colored her mother's dresses, stretching back through generations of women. She never once minded any of it. This was not labor in the way others understood labor. This was communion. This was conversation with the plant world. This was learning the language of survival. This was her mother's medicine chest, the pantry of their survival, the very foundation of life in the lowlands where the boundary between water and earth was never entirely clear. By the time Jessamine was 18 years old, she could identify and process every medicinal plant in a 20-mile radius of the Bayou homestead where she lived with her mother. She knew which roots could break a fever, which leaves could stanch a wound and prevent infection, which flowers held poison in their throats and should never be touched, which flowers held only blessing and healing power. She understood the seasonal variations of potency, understanding that plants grew stronger at certain times of year. She knew the times of day when harvest yielded the strongest medicine, the proper methods of preservation and storage that would maintain the plant's power through months or even years of storage. Her mother had given her far more than technical knowledge. She had given her a way of seeing the world, a philosophy of relationship that treated the natural world not as something separate or subordinate, but as a vast, interconnected system of reciprocity and exchange and mutual dependence. You took what you needed, but only what you needed, never more than you could use. You harvested with gratitude and with hands that remembered the gift with every motion, understanding that taking without appreciation was a kind of theft from the future. You left more than enough for regrowth, for the birds, for the small animals, for the creatures who shared the marsh, for the future whose contours you could never entirely predict. This was not sentiment or naive idealism. This was survival based on precise observation of how the natural world worked. This was respect for the way the world actually worked, the way it had worked for 10,000 years and would work for 10,000 more if humans could learn to listen. Jessamine was 22 years old when yellow fever came to the Bayou towns in the summer of 1871, moving through the communities like judgment, like a plague sent to test the strength and virtue of the people living there. The disease was carried on the backs of mosquitoes that bred in the humid heat of the swamps, invisible vectors of a sickness that burned through the body like fire consuming wood. Her mother Marguerite, who had spent her entire life coaxing life from the soil and water, who could identify 100 plants in a walk of 30 minutes and knew the medicinal properties of each, was simply not immune. The fever came quickly and moved through her body with terrifying speed, laying waste to her strength like a storm tearing through a forest. Jessamine held her mother's hand through 7 days of fever and delirium, applying cool compresses and brewing every tea in her mother's remarkable knowledge, and it made no difference. The disease moved through Marguerite's body with indifference to Jessamine's desperate skill, with indifference to the knowledge that had been accumulated across generations. When her mother finally went silent and still, Jessamine was alone in a way she had never imagined possible, in a way that made the physical world seem insubstantial and unreal. The alderman came to her shack in 1879, 2 years after her mother's passing, 2 years of learning to live in a world that no longer contained her mother's voice or her mother's guidance. His name was Beckett Thibault, and he was a solid man in a quality coat tailored in the Eastern style. The kind of man who carried authority in his bearing. The kind of man the territorial government paid attention to and empowered with decisions that affected other people's lives. He said the shack, which had belonged to Marguerite before her and to Marguerite's mother before that, stretching back through generations of women who had lived between the water and the land, was sitting on land that would soon be needed for a levee project designed to control the waterways and facilitate commerce along the river. Government initiative, he called it. Progress. Civilization moving westward. The shack was nothing but a ramshackle testimony to superstition and decay, he said, gesturing around the carefully organized interior with visible contempt, unable to see the knowledge encoded in every dried plant hanging from the rafters. Her mother's name was mentioned once, with a curl of his lip and the tone of a man speaking of something slightly unclean. Your mother's witchcraft, he said, has no place in a modern territory moving forward into an age of reason and science. Your weeds have no place here. You'll need to move on. There's no negotiation in this matter. The land is condemned. You have 3 months to vacate the property. She was still grieving in a way that made the world feel thin and strange, as if she were looking at everything from underwater. When she left the bayous in the autumn of 1879, she took only what could fit into 2 canvas bags. Her mother's notebooks filled with careful drawings of plants done in her mother's precise hand. The seeds she had stored for next year's harvest in sealed containers made from clay, every garment she owned, including the indigo dresses, and a bundle of the finest dried cattail down her mother had ever processed, kept in a sealed container to preserve its extraordinary quality for a future that felt uncertain. She walked away from the only home she had ever known in the middle of a frost-heavy autumn, and she did not look back, though her heart pulled backward like a rope fastened to something immovable. The journey to Iowa Territory took her on steamboats and then on rough wagon roads that wound deeper and deeper into the enormous flatness of the world, away from the water and green growth she understood. She had never seen so much sky. The enormous bowl of it made her feel small and exposed, as if the distance from one horizon to the other was a kind of judgment being passed on her adequacy, on her ability to survive outside the bayous. She found her way to Harrow Lake by accident, by asking for work and food at homesteads along the way, following a rumor that a widow woman named Ruth needed help with the seasonal work. Ruth Colton, a woman with hands like roots and a voice like gravel, someone who had survived the loss of a husband and half her family, and still moved through the world with a kind of fierce, unrelenting competence, took one look at Jessamine and said something that changed everything. You're a gatherer. I can see it in how you move, the way your eyes touch things. I need someone who understands plants. Come work through the summer, and we'll see how it goes from there. Jessamine stayed longer than the summer. She stayed through the autumn, watching the cottonwoods turn gold and the prairie grasses dry to a color like old ivory. She stayed through the winter of 1879 and into the spring of 1880, and when the lake froze solid enough to walk upon, and she realized she could feel her mother's presence in the extensive Cattail marshes that bordered Harrow Lake and the creek that fed it. Thousands upon thousands of the tall plants that had raised her, that her mother had taught her to speak with in the language of harvest and use. Something in her broke open like a seed that has waited through winter for the warmth of spring. This was a language she could still read. This was home. Or at least, this was a place where the language she spoke was still viable, still made sense, still connected her to something that transcended the loss and isolation that had defined her life since her mother's death. She built her cabin in the spring of 1880 on a small rise overlooking the marsh, and she made a decision that would define her life for the next several decades with a clarity that felt almost like her mother whispering directly in her ear. The walls would be thick. They would be insulated in a way that the other cabins scattered across the Iowa Territory, built with single logs and poor thinking, and the assumption that human stubbornness could overcome winter's physics could never be. They would be insulated with the very substance that had raised her and her mother before her, the down of cattail seeds, that miraculous fiber that the birds of the world had trusted for 10,000 years, that nature had perfected long before humans invented the concept of insulation. The construction took her from the spring of 1880 through the entire winter and into the summer of 1881. She built an outer wall of logs, hewn solid and careful, chinked tight with clay and grass and the same tallow that would later seal the walls against moisture. Then she built an inner wall of rough-sawn pine boards, a wall that stood exactly 6 inches inside the outer wall, creating a cavity between them like the cavity of some vast creature's heart. A space designed with mathematical precision to hold the insulation that would make all the difference. Into that cavity, she packed thousands of cattail seed heads, harvested in the wettest part of the marsh where the finest specimens grew and reached their maximum maturity. She broke them apart by hand, working methodically through the late summer heat, her fingers again staining with tannins, letting the silky fibers bloom and expand, filling the cavity until it was tightly packed with insulation, so light and fluffy it seemed almost impossible that it could hold heat. The engineering of it was simple but elegant. The cattail down in its compressed form created an R value of approximately 3.5 per inch, which meant the 6-inch cavity achieved an R value of 21, sufficient to dramatically reduce heat loss. To seal the structure against moisture, the great enemy of any insulation system, she applied tallow wax mixture to the inner face of the outer wall, creating a vapor barrier that would prevent moisture from migrating into the cavity where it might eventually damage the insulation or promote the growth of mold and decay. For the ceiling above the main room, she packed 8 inches of the same material between the rafters, creating an R value of approximately 28, sufficient for extraordinary cold. She worked alone mostly, though occasionally Ruth would come help, and she worked with the precision of someone for whom this was not a project, but a calling, a way of honoring her mother's memory and putting into physical form the knowledge that had been passed down. The other settlers in Harrow Lake watched this process with expressions that ranged from confusion to pity to something that looked like contempt. She was from the swamp, they said. She was building a nest, a bird's nest. They said it would rot, attract rats by the hundreds, catch fire in an instant. They said she was wasting effort on witchcraft. They were wrong about most of it. The cattail down does not rot because of the same elegant mechanism that allows seeds to float on water without absorbing moisture. The fibers have natural water resistance, evolved over millions of years to protect seeds during their journey. The tannins serve as natural preservative and insect deterrent, and densely packed cattail down, carefully isolated from direct flame with tallow wax barrier, is remarkably slow to ignite. Fire needs oxygen and loose materials. Compressed down offers little of either. The structure, completed in summer 1881, was unlike anything else in the territory. Double wall construction meant walls measured nearly 18 inches thick. Where neighbors burned through a cord of firewood every 3 days, Jessamine's cabin remained warm on a fraction of the fuel. She was still young when winter 1880 came. It was mild. The settlers felt vindication. They did not understand that mild winters prove nothing. She understood what her mother knew. Prepare for the worst. Years accumulated like tree rings. She lived seasons in rhythm with the marsh. Spring brought explosion of growth. Summer was for preserving. Autumn was for serious harvesting. Winter was for deep cold and watching insulation hold. She developed a reputation among the settlers that was complicated and marked with distance. She was the woman from the bayou, the one who whispered to plants, the one whose methods made no sense by the rational standards of the territories. But she was also the one whose cabin never felt cold, whose methods produced results that could not be denied. By 1881, as autumn turned with unusual sharpness, as geese moved south earlier than anyone could remember seeing them move, as the air itself took on a peculiar bite that the oldest settlers recognized as a warning of something exceptional coming, people began to pay attention to her in a different way. December came early and hard to the territory. By the second week of December, temperatures had dropped to 30 below zero, and the wind that swept across the prairie from the north seemed to carry with it the intention of erasing everything in its path, of reducing the world to bare elements and revealing the true nature of survival. By the third week of December, the thermometer that Jessamine had hung on her cabin wall showed -40, then -45. The settlers were burning through their firewood at a rate that even the most optimistic among them understood would not sustain them through January at that consumption rate. The wind howled continuously, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, a sound that made people question their own sanity after hearing it for more than a few hours without respite. On the evening of December the 23rd, in the darkness that came so early in winter that it seemed as if day had never truly existed, Margaret Coulter knocked on Jessamine's door with the kind of desperate rhythm that spoke of fear and exhaustion. She was holding a quilt around her shoulders, and her teeth were chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "My ones are too cold. Please. I don't know what to do. The fire will not keep the cold out, even right by the stove, even sleeping pressed against each other. We're turning blue." Jessamine brought her inside immediately, brought Margaret's 3 smallest ones as well, and within an hour, word had spread through the network of desperate communication that the settlers maintained by whatever means they could. Runners across the deadly cold, notes passed hand to hand, that there was one cabin on the territory that could hold heat through the worst weather anyone could remember experiencing. By nightfall of that day, 30 people had arrived at Jessamine's door, carrying what belongings they could transport through the killing wind, abandoning their inadequate homes to the mercy of winter, seeking refuge in a structure that had always been called a bird's nest and dismissed as a swamp witch's folly. She made room. She pulled out every piece of furniture from the structure, moved tables and benches outside to the storage shed, eliminated any barrier to maximizing floor space for the human beings who needed shelter. She drew upon every bit of her mother's knowledge of living in close quarters, of maintaining human dignity in tight spaces, of organizing space so that people did not feel they were suffocating under the sheer weight of proximity and desperation. She organized people into layers of depth into the cabin. The most cold vulnerable pressed nearest to the stove where the heat was strongest. The young and oldest settlers clustered in the warmest corner, where heat accumulated and lingered. She rationed her carefully stored supplies of food with mathematical precision. The cabin maintained 58 to 60 degrees, sometimes dropping to 57 on the very coldest nights when the wind came from a particular direction and seemed to have intention behind it, while the external temperature plummeted to 52 below zero and beyond. Inside, people lived. Outside, separated by 18 inches of logs and 6 inches of cattail down, and the tallow wax barrier her mother's knowledge had taught her to create, the world became a howling void where humans lasted minutes without immediate shelter. By the 7th day of the siege, Alderman Thibault sent a messenger, a young man whose fingers had already begun to show clear signs of frostbite, the tissue turning white and waxy and taking on a peculiar appearance, with a proposal that was itself a kind of surrender, though he would never have used that word. Merge the two groups, consolidate their resources and their heat, and wait out the siege together with a better chance of survival. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge his prior condemnation of her methods. He simply stated the mathematics of survival in the language of a man who understood numbers. Jessamine listened to the proposal while standing in the doorway of her cabin, the warmth pouring out around her like visible evidence of her mother's knowledge made manifest, and she thought. She thought of the shack in the bayous that Thibault had condemned, of the knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition. She thought of her mother, who had been called a witch for knowing what the natural world offered. She thought of every dismissal and every moment of condescension, every time she had been looked through rather than at. And then she thought of the 30 people crowded into her cabin, of the smallest faces pressed against the warmth seeking comfort, of the human responsibility that transcended any personal injury, any old wound, any desire for vindication. "Tell him yes," she said to the messenger, a young man who looked like he might not survive if he had to make the return journey. "Tell him to bring his people at dawn, when the light is strongest and the journey is slightly less perilous. But tell him also that he should come understanding that in this cabin every person will be treated as equal. There is no hierarchy of worth when the temperature outside is 52 below zero. There is only survival and the knowledge that got us here." The alderman arrived at dawn with 19 additional people from his own cabin and his household. The combined group of nearly 50 people filled every inch of Jessamine's cabin and spilled into what she had used as a storage shed, which she had hastily insulated with more cattail down-pulled from her harvest stores, more layers of blankets and quilts, more desperate human ingenuity. The stove burned continuously, tended in shifts that Jessamine organized and managed, with wood consumed and rationed with such precision that she calculated daily whether supplies would last until the weather broke. The worst came on the 8th day. The thermometer read -52. The wind gusted to 40 miles per hour or beyond what the crude instrument could accurately measure. Snow fell in waves. But then, just as the supplies were running desperately low, just as the tension in the cabin was becoming almost unbearable, the wind died. It died to a whisper. The thermometer climbed to -30, then to -20. The sky opened to blue. The siege was breaking, and slowly, carefully, with gratitude measured out and expressed in ways both visible and invisible, the settlers began the process of moving back to their own cabins, of assessing what had been damaged by the cold and the wind, of understanding that they had survived something that would have been impossible to survive in ordinary circumstances, that would have been absolutely fatal if they had remained in their original cabins. They had survived because of Cattail down. They had survived because a woman from the Bayou had remembered the knowledge of her mother and built a structure that could hold them safe. Alderman Beckett Thibault stood in her doorway before leaving, and for the first time in any encounter she could remember, he looked at her directly, not through her or past her, but directly at her face, at her dark eyes that held knowledge he could not access, at her hands still stained with the work of a lifetime of gathering. He did not apologize. He was not, by his nature, capable of that vulnerability. But he said, "Your mother's knowledge, it was not witchcraft." And she understood that for a man like Thibault, that was the same thing as an apology. That was acknowledgement. That was worth. "No," Jessamine said. "It was observation. It was respect. It was understanding that the plants teach us if we listen carefully, if we put aside what we think we know and pay attention to what the world is actually showing us." He nodded once and left her cabin into the cold that was now merely dangerous rather than absolutely fatal. The story of what had happened during the siege spread through the Iowa Territory and beyond, carried by travelers and settlers moving between communities. The Frontier Hearth publication, in its quarterly issue of 1882, ran an article titled "The Cattail Walls, Natural Insulation, and the Future of Settlement Architecture in the Territories." Builders and settlers began to inquire about the methods of double wall construction with cattail down, asking careful questions about specifications and materials and techniques. By 1883, 3 new cabins had been built using the same technique in the vicinity of Harrow Lake. By 1885, the method was standard practice for anyone who had the time and resources to implement it properly. By 1890, it was considered the standard best practice for cold climate settlement construction. Jessamine Tulliver had, without intending to do so, without seeking recognition or credit, changed the way humans built shelter in the territories. But Jessamine never built another cabin after her own. She stayed in her own structure, which had proven itself through the worst that the Iowa winter could deliver, which stood as a physical testament to her mother's knowledge and her own skill and patience and understanding. She continued her work as a gatherer and herbalist, continued to heal the settlers who came to her with ailments that the territory doctor could not cure, continued to speak the language that her mother had taught her. She taught anyone who came to her with genuine curiosity about the plants of the marsh, how to identify them, how to harvest them respectfully, how to process them into medicine. She never married, never relocated, never showed the slightest interest in the life that the settled territories began building around her. Every spring, as water warmed and the cattails began their ascension toward the sky, reaching toward the light as they had done for millions of years, she would walk to the edge of Harrow Lake and stand among the marsh plants, and she would think of her mother. She would think of the bayous and the slow water that moved through the landscape like lifeblood of the earth. She would think of the thick green air of Louisiana. She would think of hands stained with tannins and fingers breaking apart the dense brown seed heads, watching the silk bloom and expand like magic, understanding that this simple action, repeated across thousands of specimens across decades, could mean the difference between survival and freezing. Her mother was not alive to see the cabin hold firm through the worst winter. Her mother was not alive to see the alderman acknowledge what he had dismissed so thoroughly. Her mother was not alive to see the knowledge that had seemed like superstition transform into the foundation of better building and shelter. but her mother was alive in every breath that Jessamine took in that warm cabin. Her mother was alive in every plant Jessamine identified, every remedy she formulated, every settler she taught to listen to what the marsh was communicating. Her mother was alive in the very substance of the walls, in the millions of cattail fibers that held the cold at bay, that kept the warmth close, that allowed one woman with knowledge and respect to become the shelter in which 30 people survived the unsurvivable. This is what happens when we listen. This is what happens when we honor the knowledge that has been passed down through generations, when we respect the teaching that lives in the plants, when we understand that the natural world has been offering instruction since long before there were settlements and territories and aldermen seeking to impose order. This is what happens when a woman remembers, when she carries forward, when she understands that her mother's hands are still moving through hers, still teaching, still reaching across the distance of absence to hold fast the people that need holding. The cattail marshes of Iowa grew as they had always grown, unmarked by history, unremarkable except to those who understood the profound value of what they offered to the world. But in that one cabin, on that one rise, overlooking those eternal marshes, the ancient knowledge of survival remained alive, warm, present, and entirely real. And the marsh whispered on, in the ancient voices of wind and water, teaching still.